Utah has a plan to deal with homelessness, lining up behind President Trump's belief that people should not be allowed to sleep on the streets. State officials say they're preparing to pull more than 1,000 homeless people out of Salt Lake City and into a sprawling campus on the outskirts of town. Supporters call it a place where people can get the services they need. Critics call it a detention camp. Joining us now, New York Times reporter Ellen Berry, who filed that piece from Salt Lake City. So what exactly is this campus, this camp?
So for now, this is still in its planning stages. It hasn't been built, but it is definitely an effort to kind of operationalize the president's executive order from the summer, which said that overwhelmingly homeless people are suffering from mental illness or addiction, and overwhelmingly they should be put into long-term institutional care. That is a reversal of our longstanding approach to homelessness, which has prioritized housing. So this plan is a very large facility that would be devoted in large part to treatment of psychiatric and substance abuse disorders.
So it's kind of, you could argue, bringing back mental health institutions, which had fallen out of favor. There are arguments on both sides of this, as you well know, as you've reported. There are people who say it is not a good idea to let people suffer on the streets, that some people really do need help and they're not capable of getting themselves that help. And there are others that say if you force them into an institution or camp or campus, whatever you want to call it, and you don't allow them to leave, you violate their civil rights, you violate their free will. Do we have a sense of what this campus, if it's actually going to be staffed, if it's actually going to have the resources they need, and how it's going to be funded?
There are lots of questions, and those are some of the most important ones. The proposal, as I understood it, is actually a hybrid with about 1/3 of the beds, a kind of low barrier shelter, so that would be presumably voluntary, and the other 2/3, 800 beds, would be involuntary. Either through civil commitment procedures or a diversion program through the courts. So you're sort of looking at a large facility that is in part involuntary and in part voluntary.
Do we know who's paying for this?
Well, it would have to be the Utah legislature, and that is a big question mark, whether there is going to be willingness to fund it. And I think the fear is that if this ball gets rolling and the services are not funded, then it becomes much more of a warehousing type facility and less of a treatment facility. So this is what is not yet clear. It's expensive to create psychiatric beds, and across the country we have a shortage of psychiatric beds for that reason. So expanding psychiatric treatment in this way would be extraordinarily expensive.
Yeah. Ellen Berry. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Joining us now, Utah State Senator. She was featured in that piece, Jen Plum, a Democrat who represents Salt Lake City. She's also an ER physician. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
What are your concerns?
You know, this is a space that I have been passionate about and touched by for decades, starting with my own brother facing heroin dependence and addiction and ultimately losing him to that. And then coming into the space as a clinician and an advocate, and now as an elected person, I think that I share the hopes that many of those thinking in this space are, and then that is what we can get people better lives, and that we can do things with policy that will get people into spaces where they aren't living in such desperation. But seeing this proposal and seeing it come from a homeless services board that doesn't have a single medical person on it to represent what it would take, I'm worried that these good intentions have the potential to lead to wasted time, wasted money, and violations of people's civil liberties. So for me, that's kind of the, in a nutshell, concerns that I have.
That is a good point. And again, I think it's important to remember that there are people that do really need help and are struggling, and there are family members who want their loved ones to get the help that they need. And sometimes, in some cases, voluntary is not necessarily an option. That being said, you are a part of the legislature and you've expressed your concerns. Is there a way to amend any legislation that might come up to make it so that it's mandatory to have a certain number of healthcare professionals, of addiction professionals, psychiatric professionals on staff and there every year in order to make sure that these places don't become detention centers?
I think that's really a crucial point. And how much of that happens in policy and code versus how much of that happens in planning, that all remains to be seen. You know, we've almost hit this inflection point where folks are saying, oh, housing first didn't work. Now we need this treatment first model. And for me, I don't see it that there's opposing camps. I see it that there's the same needs for people. And for me, housing first was supposed to mean get a roof over people's head first, and then get them the treatment they need, the supports they need, the case management they need, the education they need. Housing first, for me, that's what that meant, and then build upon. But our systems didn't necessarily fund those resources, right? So we call it a failure when really it wasn't the structure or the system so much as the resources there.
Yeah.
We're not that far apart on what people need. Where our chasm is the expectation of whether or not we can force people into it or not. I personally know from a fact, from a family member and from a clinician, you cannot force people into wellness. You have to provide an environment that supports them, and they have to want it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's also, I mean, when the institutions were dismantled, there was an idea that they weren't safe spaces, they weren't helpful, and that it would be better for people to be in the community and be treated in the community so they could be closer to family and they could recover and become a functioning part of society. It was that second step that never got followed through on, which has led us to where we are today. Do you have a partner in the legislature right now that is willing to try to put this down on paper to make sure that if this facility does go online, that it can actually be a model of success rather than just another, failed attempt to solve a complicated problem?
You know, I think that there are a number of partners that I can look to, and that I hope we have the kind of collaborative relationships where we can go head on at this as a problem, right? Not as a political problem, but as an actual human problem and as an actual policy response problem. I think we've got to have some honesty about what this is going to cost to build it. I personally don't believe a structure of 14 buildings can be built for $75 million. I know that staffing that facility will take more than $34 million a year. So I think we need to start with some kind of transparency about what it's really going to cost if we're going to try to do something like this. But personally, my hope is that we can get minds together with subject matter expertise and understanding. Good intentions that are ill-informed don't help people. They just waste money and they waste time. So my hope is I can find those partners, that our system can come together, not to battle, but to support one another. And let's actually do what's right by people, not just make a splash.
The state of Utah announced its new plan for a services campus on the west side of Salt Lake City, literal mosquito swampland, where it plans to have 1,300 unhoused people, but people that care about people have classified this as a detention camp. After a very secretive search, the Homeless Services Board announced this new campus. The new head of this organization is a guy named Randy Shumway, who is a consultant turned homelessness czar. And this new service center is going to have an involuntary accountability center, and that includes 400 psychiatric beds for court-ordered treatment for mental illness, 400 addiction recovery beds as alternatives to jail, and this is all going to be run by law enforcement quote-unquote rescue teams that will find people that are homeless and offer them a choice. You can either go to court or go to this campus. And this center, you cannot come and go on your own. You have to stay there. It's essentially a prison, another prison.
Donald Trump issued an executive order that called for strict camping bans, expanded power to involuntarily treat homeless individuals, and the creation of large tent cities on cheap land. Governor Cox was very excited by this executive order, and he immediately told state leaders and city cities to follow it. Utah has been a somewhat pioneer in addressing homelessness. We first approached this through what they called the housing first model, where we reduced homelessness by getting people into housing before addressing addiction or mental illness. We are apparently pioneering the next iteration, which they are calling the treatment first approach, tying basic shelter to compliant sobriety and submission. So the New York Times, in the piece that they released this week, interviewed some homeless folks in Pioneer Park, and one of them said, okay, so straight up, this reminds me of a concentration camp.
The cost for this services campus has a price tag of $75 million just for the construction. And it's going to cost $34 million annually to operate. And don't worry, we are a fiscally conservative state. We're just going to cannibalize current housing efforts instead of putting more money into solving this very important problem. Josh Romney, son of Mitt Romney, cautioned the state, saying that diverting $17 million from these other organizations will increase homelessness. He said we're going to be pulling people out of housing and into homelessness because of this plan.
On October 30th, Governor Cox named Representative Tyler Clancy as the next state's homelessness coordinator. Tyler Clancy is not a homelessness expert. He is not an addiction treatment expert. He's not a social worker. He's not anything in the field of homelessness. Tyler Clancy is a cop. This is a sign that Governor Cox wants to treat homelessness with law enforcement and compliance. Tyler Clancy was the former executive director of the Pioneer Park Coalition, who renamed themselves Solutions Utah. Their entire approach to homelessness was often get help or go to jail, which sounds familiar to all of this. As a legislator, Tyler Clancy has spent his last 2 legislative sessions building policy that follows that exact same approach. So now our entire homelessness strategy is in the hands of law enforcement rather than local government. Tyler Clancy plans to resign from the legislature after the 2026 legislative session, and then his seat will be up. That is a more competitive district than one might think. It's in the Provo area.
The new surge of interest on Utah's homelessness plan comes at a really critical point in Utah. We had an 18% increase in a single year. That is the largest jump that we have seen in recent history. A lot of the reason that this has happened is because of rising housing costs, stagnated wages, underfunded mental health and substance use disorder treatments. And on top of that, we are seeing people losing their SNAP benefits, people losing their Medicaid and Medicare, people's health insurance going up, all kinds of things that are going to push more people into homelessness. And now we are seeing Utah treating homelessness like a crime and essentially putting people into a prison in the middle of nowhere if they are homeless. These are the repercussions of the choices that people make in office and who we vote for. When talking about this new campus, Governor Cox said this is a statement of who we are as a state. And he is exactly right about that. When we talk about people that are homeless like they are problems to be solved, or every one of them has mental illness or substance use disorder, or it's their own fault for not working hard enough, we are doing a huge disservice not only to ourselves, but to our neighbors. You know more people than you think you do that are one financial incident away from being homeless. A lot of people that are on food assistance that you have no idea are on food assistance. These are our neighbors, these are our friends, these are our family members, and continuing to not treat people that are homeless with any sort of dignity or compassion or respect at all leads to this kind of model where they are involuntarily locked up and forced to be in a place that they do not want to be in. And that should be frightening to everyone in this country, frankly.
They want to put up more of these alligator Alcatraz style mega tent sprung structure type facilities. They've got the kind of pilot project for that in Utah, where the governor has said, we are going to completely support and implement Trump's executive order. And just last week, their homelessness board, which was created by some Cicero legislation, they passed a plan for a 1,300 person megatent camp 7 miles outside of downtown in the middle of nowhere, no public transportation. 300 beds are going to be involuntarily committed, locked facilities. Another set of beds are going to be no voluntary entry or exit. It's going to be where you get sent for jail diversion. And then the rest of the beds, even though theoretically you could come and go, they're going to be actively enforcing anti-camping, anti-loitering, all these other laws. The thing that scares me the most is that they say some of these units are going to be work-conditioned housing, which to me means forced labor. And we've seen some of these other bills introduced at the state level that also have this forced labor element to them in Louisiana and West Virginia. To my eyes, I see them kicking out all the undocumented, low-paid labor from the country. Gotta make up for it somewhere. Gotta make up for it somewhere.
Well, this isn't extremely fucking disturbing. Utah is literally building a compound to involuntarily hold homeless Americans. 16 acres, 1,300 people, locked behind gates. And they're calling this shit care. This is not compassion, y'all. This is containment. Instead of building affordable housing, instead of wages where people can actually live on, they're building a camp to hide the poverty. How the fuck is this a solution? We do not deserve a government that solves problems by disappearing people. We deserve safety, housing, support, not fence lines and fucking barbed wire. The more we normalize this, the closer we slide into history that we swore we would never repeat. Pay attention, man, because this is happening on United States soil, y'all. And if this becomes normal in one state, how long before every state adopts it? This is not about helping people, man. It's about getting them the fuck out of sight.